One of the core concepts in the history of Western esotericism is that hidden, profound, ancient, even salvific knowledge has been transmitted down through history, despite persecutions through things like the Inquisition, but can be found by those worthy to unlock it. Such knowledge was thought to be hidden in ancient lost books, scrolls hidden in Egyptian temples, monuments of emerald and turquoise, and fragments spread all through the ravages of time. But, strangely enough, it wasn't until the early 17th century that a group of secret initiates claimed that they had indeed recovered, preserved, and transmitted just that knowledge within their ranks. These brothers of the Rosy Cross claimed secret knowledge which would reform, unite, and transform religion, nature, medicine, alchemy, metaphysics, mathematics, basically everything. And in 1614, they made their existence known to the world in print via the famous Fama Fraternitatis. This volume, with its promises of radical reform, set off a firestorm, making it perhaps the first such volume like it in history in print to go truly viral, with literally hundreds of responses to it occurring in print from 1614 to about 1620. And that fire never went out, despite there being no evidence for the existence of a historical Rosicrucian orders producing those manifestos. Numerous individuals and secret societies have sprung up through the subsequent centuries claiming to take up the mantle of the Rosy Cross. This episode will be the first in a series exploring topics in the history of Rosicrucianism, an order that so many felt and still feel needed to exist, regardless of whether it did and didn't. They made it exist. Make sure to subscribe for weekly explorations and topics of esoteric history. And if you'd like to support the work of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible scholarship like this, I'd hope you consider checking out my merch and maybe supporting me over at my Patreon. If you're new to the study of esotericism and you want to sort of get the lay of the land, I've made a very comprehensive study guide that I hope will do just that for you. And if you're interested in actual historical books of mysticism and the occult, check out my bookstore at Esoterica Rare Books. You can find all those links in the description and in the pinned comment. But now, let's begin our exploration, a series on the history of the Rosicrucians and the utopian reform that they inspired, that alarmed, and transformed Europe in the 17th century. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. I'll beg your apologies as I start this episode. You can probably hear in my voice that I've been getting over a terrible bout of the flu, so I'm sorry if my voice is a little scratchy or kind of comes in and out, but I'm doing the best I can, folks. But by the first quarter of the 17th century, Europe was still reeling from the Protestant Revolution, one that had disrupted Catholic hegemony all through Europe. But the dream of a radical Protestant Reformation had stagnated even among the Protestants. Factions had emerged, concord was lost, the revolution of faith had fundamentally splintered, and soon the 30 Years' War would erupt. But shared among so many Catholics and Protestants, and even Jews at the time, was a deep sense that the world itself was in its final apocalyptic drama. The end was near. The Protestants saw in the Roman Pope the literal Antichrist. Catholics saw something very similar in Calvin and Luther. The Americas had been discovered, the globe had been rounded, Copernicus and then Galileo had fundamentally shifted our location in the cosmos. They had seen moons around Jupiter, phases of Venus. Millenarian expectation took the form of calculations for the transformations and ultimately the end of the world. The prophecies of people like Joachim of Fiore were thought to be coming true in their lifetime, ushering in the final age of the Holy Spirit in the early 17th century. Then in 1602, a new star appeared, actually a comet. And then in 1603, we would have a conjunction in the sky of Saturn and Jupiter in Pisces, an astrological portent of positive messianic meaning. Further astrological signs would then appear, and then another star. This time a supernova would appear in October of 1604. Kepler, who had himself already occult leanings, argued that this was truly an omen. It was nothing less than the appearance of the star of Bethlehem that heralded the birth of Jesus. Protestant political hopes were also high, as the Elector Frederick V of the Palatinate, with his new bride Elizabeth, daughter of James I, would form a bloc against Habsburg Catholic power. That didn't quite work out, but there was hope. Finally, Hermetic, Kabbalistic, and occult philosophy were powerfully circulating through Europe via print, from texts of ancient wisdom to their contemporary adepts, such as Ficino, Pico, Reuchlin, Agrippa, D. Bruno, the people that regularly appear on this channel, and so many others. They all shared in the imminent possibility of a general reform of spirituality, religion, science, art, philosophy, politics, everything, along Hermetic and Kabbalistic grounds. In effect, the first quarter of the 17th century was a religious, political, and spiritual powder keg, especially in Central Europe, and it would be the publication of the Fama Fraternitatis, the fame of the Rosicrucian Brotherhood, by those alleged Rosicrucians that would, at least in part, set it all off. The 1614 Fama Fraternitatis is ironically named, at least in the context of 1614, with the exception of a very few people that had seen the text floating around in manuscript. Virtually no one in Europe had ever heard of the Rosicrucians. The fame of that brotherhood, it simply didn't exist. Not yet, at least. That was about to change. Of course, as I imagine all of you know, the fame of that brotherhood rests primarily on 3 anonymous manifestos. The Fama Fraternitatis, published in German at Kassel in 1614, the Confessio Fraternitatis, published in Latin in Frankfurt in 1615, and the chemical, or better, alchemical wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, published at Strasbourg in 1616. Now, as this is the first in a series of episodes on the Rosicrucians, I'm primarily going to be focusing on the first document for this episode, the Fama Fraternitatis, the philosophy and the question of who might have written it. But the Fama did not appear on its own in its first printing. Rather, it appeared with an Italian tract by Boccolini urging for radical religious and social reformation, a general kind of anti-Habsburg, anti-papal sentiment, and some general ideas supporting the idea of the independence of Venice. Then, along with the Fama, we find a reply to that text, basically proving that the text was in some form of manuscript circulation prior to its printing in 1614 by a fellow named Adam Hasselmeyer. And here begins the revelation of the colorful cast of characters likely associated with the production of the Fama and the other Rosicrucian Manifestos. Now, in brief, Hasselmeyer is exactly the kind of person that would be taken up with the Rosicrucian agenda. He had developed a very peculiar, specific line of radical theological Paracelsianism. Yes, theological Paracelsianism that he termed Triaphastria Sancta. This was basically a theological reform agenda along the lines of the light of nature, which could, to his mind, unite the various sectarian chaos dominating his world using theological texts written toward the end of Paracelsus's life. This involves seeking the divine in the study and the transformation of nature, both nature at large, but also human nature, the human spirit. Thus, nature itself becomes a kind of gospel, such that one may learn true piety of loving one's enemies, abandoning selfhood, suffering slander, and refusing all worldly honor. Typical Christian stuff. For Hasselmeyer, the spiritual illumination was to be found not in the church of wood and stone, but in the church of nature, in the church of the spirit, sought through the divine light of reason, which illuminated the adept to the diminishing of the ego in the service of humankind more generally. Now, to be honest, this guy already sounds like a Rosicrucian, so it's not a surprise in the least that his very enthusiastic reply to the Fama was printed with it. But what is the Fama Fraternitatis? Why did this pamphlet cause such a firestorm in Central Europe? In effect, the Fama is a biography of the Rosicrucians as an order, and especially their founder, who we eventually come to know as Christian Rosenkreuz. Said to have been born in 1378, he first lived for the first 5 years of his life in a cloister, mastering all the ancient languages he would need before setting out to pilgrimage to Jerusalem at the age of 16. Now, that fact of him living in a cloister is probably a nod to him at a very early age superseding the need for Catholicism, gaining all the knowledge he would need and kind of leaving it behind at the age of 5. So that's some shade on the Catholics. Before heading off in the direction of course, authentic spiritual knowledge and discovery. However, his traveling companion would die at Cyprus, with Christian now foregoing Jerusalem. Again, this might also be a bit of a shade upon Judaism a little bit, for a otherwise mysterious city that is known as Damcar in Arabia. Now, Damcar is often mistranslated as Damascus, but this city first appears on maps around this time, perhaps Damcar being a mistake for Damar, a city in what is now Yemen. Now, why exactly this city, Damar, has been debated for a couple centuries. Did the writer of the text associate it with the so-called Hermetic Sabaeans? Was there a connection here to the Queen of Sheba? Or just a sort of generally exotic East kind of idea, which was a pretty common trope in esoteric texts of that time? It's not clear. But arriving in the city as an expected guest, the adducts of Damcar train our hero in medicine, mathematics, and Arabic, all the while he's translating a Liber M, perhaps Liber Mundi, the Book of the World, from Arabic into Latin. Of course, Latin alchemists at that time very well knew that they had inherited basically all of their alchemical wisdom from their Islamic forebears, and thus returning to the source of that knowledge was very much in keeping with the Renaissance, sort of early modern ad fontes, back to the sources approach through the discovery as recovery of ancient wisdom. Kind of surprised my voice is still holding up. But after 3 years, Christian would continue his journey over northern Africa with no stop in Egypt, which is interesting, but now he would go all the way to the west to Fez in Morocco, where he would study the secrets of magic and Kabbalah. Now, it's at this point we do get a glimpse into the Rosicrucian philosophy. Here it's founded upon a harmony of the entire world, such that the macrocosm and the microcosm reflect and inform one another. These are both classic tropes of both Hermetic, but specifically Paracelsian philosophy and theology, so that's unsurprising. Indeed, the text chides the Germans of the German readers that the magicians, Kabbalists, doctors, and philosophers should also be willing to collaborate for the sense of the truth, for the sake of the truth with anybody in the world. This is a powerful message of not just trans-denominational Christianity, a trans-denominational Christian desire for truth, but a radical trans-religious urging that Christians be willing to learn from Muslims and perhaps even Jews in the interest of getting at the truth. Morocco, of course, had long been famous, along with Yemen, by the way, as centers of deep Kabbalistic learning. Christian would then return to Christian Spain. Probably again, this is just heaping a bit of shade upon the Catholics and the Habsburgs, where his wisdom was promptly rejected by everybody. Indeed, the world seems moreover completely incapable of accepting the revelation and philosophy of this proto-Rosicrucian revelation. The text even notes for us that Paracelsus alone, while not a Rosicrucian, was the only person hitherto that had come to the true light. Now, I've done a whole series about Paracelsus that will never end because Paracelsus wrote an unimaginable amount of literature. But if you're interested in Paracelsus and you want to check out and learn more about him as a kind of proto-Rosicrucian, I suppose, you can check out some of my episodes on Paracelsus. But failing to illuminate Europeans, Christian retired back to Germany, quietly producing works of mechanical art. But the text does tell us that if he wanted to, he could have been transmuting things to gold, but he was kind of above that. And after a period of about 5 years, he again strikes out for the sake of reformation, taking 3 former members from his cloister as the foundation of the fraternity of the Rosy Cross. These four forge a new kind of magical language. This is maybe a vague reference to John Dee's Monos Hieroglyphica, which I've done a whole series about if you want to check that out, to which to encode their knowledge and privately praise the glory of God. This order would gain a headquarters, the so-called House of the Holy Spirit, and would eventually grow to 8 in number, and they would see their secret philosophy recorded at this point for the first time. Now, we also get the first rules of the emergent Rosicrucian order, and these would include things like not wearing distinctive costumes, meeting on certain days of the year, training a worthy disciple, that the existence of the Brotherhood should remain secret for at least 100 years, and most of all, providing medical services for free for anyone that asks. This medical element of Rosicrucianism, again, very much tied up with Paracelsian concerns, is interesting because, to my mind, while it's very clearly central in the Fama, I don't think it became a major concern for many latter-day Rosicrucians. We also learned that a certain Rosicrucian brother, J.O., learned in Kabbalah, was the first to pass away over in England, and eventually even when and where Brother Christian Rosenkreuz would perish and was entombed, actually becomes lost knowledge even to the brothers within the order. It was just that esoteric. Until we obviously get a hidden tomb narrative, because we need a hidden tomb narrative, likely here filled with vast numerological and Kabbalistic symbolism. Christian's vault is accidentally uncovered, and we learn of the specific geometric measurements and how it was even supernaturally lit as if by an underground sun. The tomb is replete with various magnificent tools and tomes of profound knowledge, including, oddly enough, volumes of Paracelsus. I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, they unseal his crypt, and the brothers, of course, find the saintly, undecayed body of Christian, grasping a book containing wisdom beyond wisdom. His tomb itself is like a microcosm of the macrocosm, and finally we learn a little bit more about the philosophy of the Brotherhood. It's a form of esoteric proto-Protestantism of only two sacraments whose alchemical goals are primarily not the transmutation of gold, again, something primarily in keeping with Paracelsian themes, which are primarily medical in nature. Finally, and most excitingly, the Secret Brotherhood puts out a call for anyone wishing to make contact with them. The order, secret for now 100 years, was coming out of the closet, coming out of the crypt. It was finally reaching out for all those who would see the Rosicrucian reform reach all of Europe and perhaps the entire world. Under the shadow of thy wings, Jehovah. So, did Christian Rosenkreuz or the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross exist prior to the 1614 publication of the Fama Fraternitatis? Probably not. Or rather, no substantial evidence has yet been produced to indicate that they did. And trust me, that's not for lack of looking. People really, really want there to have been Rosicrucians. So much so that they just became Rosicrucians, despite the evidence. So much so that, again, like I said, they just became them. But there are many elements which seem to point in the direction that the character and function of the order are much more hermetic and Kabbalistic and alchemical in their symbolism than a statement of historical facts of a guy that goes to Damkar and finds a hermetic order. I'll give just one instance that jumps immediately to mind. The works of Paracelsus were said to have been found in Christian's tomb, but if we do some basic math, Christian would have perished around 1484. That's about a decade prior to even the birth of Paracelsus, much less his first known writings, which are composed only around 1530. So I suspect that what matters is less the Fama as a work of history, but the Fama as a kind of myth to underwrite an as of yet vague but kind of mystical form of Hermetic Protestantism. Now, we'll be laying out the specifics of that Rosicrucian confession, the actual beliefs of the Rosicrucian to be laid out in a sequel to this video, but basically they hate the Pope and love the Bible, so that's a preview. But the second question is, if the secret brotherhood of the Rosy Cross didn't write the Fama Fraternitatis, then who did? And this is a moment where I get to lay down some real praise here, folks. Dr. Carlos Gilly. If you're watching this, just know, sir, that you are one of the true founders and scholars of this entire field, an amazing scholar. And I had the privilege of meeting you just once in Amsterdam, and it blew my mind. Folks, if I could clone 50 Carlos Gillies, we'd have this whole business of Western esotericism buttoned up in about 5 years. He is an astounding scholar that I don't think has gotten nearly the credit he deserves. So I want to take a brief moment in this episode to acknowledge your scholarship. He literally unearthed the foundational documents in his search, including manuscripts of the Fama Fraternitatis that no one knew existed, some of the only printings of the original response, etc., etc. Dr. Carlos Gilly, folks, is a true pioneer in this field. Thank you, Dr. Gilly. But if not the Rosicrucians, then who? Well, we don't know. Sorry. The literature seems to have emerged from Tübingen. Hasselmeyer seems to have been one of the first people outside of Tübingen to know about the literature, specifically circulating among mystically inclined heterodox Protestants. Mystically inclined heterodox Protestants seems to be the band name for this episode. But for this segment, I feel like I should have like the crazy conspiracy board behind me with all the lines connected with a bunch of strings with the pictures of a bunch of dudes with like beards and ruffs and skull caps. People that kind of look alike. But as far as we can tell, most scholars connect the Rosicrucian trilogy with the so-called Tübingen circle, specifically around Johannes Valentinus Andreae, who did confess ultimately to writing The Chemical Wedding around 1605 in a posthumous document of his own admission. But around him was a kind of circle of people that also seemed to basically fit the bill of being proto-Rosicrucians, including the Hermetic Utopian law professor Christoph Besold, whose huge 4,000 plus volume occult library Andreae had access to. To this list, we have to add a person who's basically a Rosicrucian already. It's the Paracelsian physician Tobias Hess, who was obsessed with a voluminous work of numerological prophecy, a text called the Naometria by Simon Studium, that is suggested as early as 1597 that the Antichrist papacy would collapse in 1604. Again, these dates all seem to weirdly line up with a bunch of Rosicrucian material. Yeah, it's called the Naometria, literally the measurements of the temple, and it was a 2,000 plus page work of numerological speculation, calculating various events in the sequence coming up basically to the end of the world using various biblical texts, especially texts like Daniel and the book of Revelation. And calculations from this text and from the so-called Tübingen circle often seem to line up uncannily with the life and times of Christian Rosenkreuz, the Brotherhood, and the publication of the Rosicrucian Manifestos. So, prophecy or just good marketing? You decide. Of course, there are plenty of evidentiary gaps in this story and even contraindicators that this might be the correct story, including the fact that Johannes Andreae greatly distanced themselves not only from the manifestos, which he denoted ultimately as a ludibrium, a prank or a joke, a lampoon, a lark, or something similar, and indeed his later works often sought a much more orthodox Lutheran tone, inviting the faithful into a truly Christian initiatory order rather than a bunch of Rosicrucian role-playing. But again, Andreae and Hess seem like our best and most reasonable candidates for the authorship, but until further evidence comes forward, we're likely never going to know exactly who wrote these documents. And yes, I hear the person in the back screaming Francis Bacon over and over. It's gonna be okay. Just take a breath. There you go. The truth of the matter, I suspect, is that if it weren't these specific manifestos, it probably would have been something similar that would have sparked this furor that emerged during this time. The time for the idea had basically come, and people were clamoring over each other to seek out the Brotherhood, to praise it, to condemn it, to accuse others of membership, to claim membership for themselves, and so on and so on. Even Descartes, the founder of rationalism, went looking for the Rosicrucians and was accused of being one when he returned. And whether or not there ever were Rosicrucians before 1614, there simply had to be Rosicrucians after 1614. And in the next episode, we're going to look at the first true Rosicrucian creed, the Confessio Fraternitatis, published in Latin in Frankfurt in 1615, and see how this movement would obtain its first true exemplars in some sense: the physician and alchemist Michael Meyer and the occult philosopher Robert Fludd. Now, the literature on the Rosicrucians is mixed. The Godwin McIntosh edition of the Rosicrucian Manifestos is, to my mind, the best version in English, with a ton of even helpful and nice illustrations, especially in the sections on the alchemical wedding. Tobias Churton's Invisible History of the Rosicrucians is a really fun and good read, providing a really interesting balance of a solid command of the historical material, though I will say it sometimes drifts into the kind of I want to believe territory, so use a little caution, but it's a fine text. Again, anything by Carlos Gilly is solid, if not a bit technical probably. And of course, I have to mention Dame Frances Yates's book, Rosicrucian Enlightenment, which is well worth the read, as it's also pretty terribly outdated and overly speculative, especially in the appearance of the manifestos with the political conditions in Central Europe of the time. You got to read Dame Frances Yates. There's no way around it. You got to read her, but you also got to take it with a bit of a grain of salt. Also, I should mention a special thanks at the end of this episode to Herr Joost Ritman, whose library in Amsterdam I've visited many times. I've worked in. And when I think of a person who I imagine as a modern-day Rosicrucian, it's you, Herr Ritman. So again, I want to thank you for all the work you've done to make this kind of material accessible. I have a lot more positive things to say about the library. I'm going to make a whole episode about the library at some point, but I couldn't make an episode introducing the study of Rosicrucianism without acknowledging your deep commitment to what I think of as the best values of things like Rosicrucianism as they exist in the contemporary world. Dankjewel, Herr Ritman. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica. Thank you for putting up with my voice in this episode. I'm going to go lie down a little bit and rest, but thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.